Hi everyone, today is part 2 of Steeplechase. Why am I having a second video about something I've already completed? This quilt has quite a story, and as I go along, I'm figuring out the story. So, if you recall from the last video, I mentioned only once that this quilt top smelled, and I told you that it smelled of urine and wet dog, but in reality it was worse than wet dog. I don't know if any of you have ever had a dog that had mange. Our neighbors had a dog that was kept outside, and you would go outside and it would literally smell like red mange. It's a combination of a wet dog and maybe football pads from your son being in football, who has never washed anything in his locker, all the bacteria and stuff in it. It was a smell like that. It was very putrid. It wasn't death. It was just very putrid. And I did not notice it when I bought the top, because obviously you're not smelling antiques whenever you go there to shop. So I didn't notice it at the time. When I got it home, it was evident the first time I kind of flipped it out, it stunk. And I knew it was going to be a challenge to finish. The filth of that quilt was so bad that after I got it off the quilting frame, I made an executive decision to wash it before I was going to bind it. I did not want that smell up against me, up against my sewing machine, coming in contact with anything, because I was afraid that smell would transfer. So I washed it. The old rule is you don't wash a top or a quilt until it's finished. And I really worried about it, but I thought, well, if this is a fail, I'm only out my time and $12. So, obviously, you just saw that it turned out fine. There are some great takeaways from this. So, the first of all, it survived the wash just fine. I was really shocked at how murky and brown the water was, considering this is a muslin quilt, so it's not white, it's off-white. And it didn't look that dirty. It just smelled dirty. I put it on gentle cycle. I used a soap that is not a synthetic soap. Most soaps of today are all made to deal with synthetic dyes in the fabric, and therefore it would not do well with these fibers because they're from the past. I kind of wondered what fabric detergent I was going to use. We do some things here a little bit old-fashioned. My last two children, who are now potty trained and fine, we did cloth diapers with them, and there was a strict regimen of detergents and what was best for baby. And because you have unbleached muslin diapers, you learned what detergents were best, no scents, and they were best for the skin. Well, if they're best for humans, we're a natural fiber, right? I mean, technically we're all natural. It is, it would work for the quilt. So I went by the package directions, and for those of you who are interested in washing a quilt, look out there. There is detergents called Rock and Green. I did not use Rock and Green. I did not have any. You can use these on your clothes. We've done that for a very long time. what I used was a brand called Molly Suds, and I don't know how old these soaps are, but it worked very well. Particular detergents are formulated naturally to remove the icky smell out of diapers, and it removed the icky smell out of this quilt. I was a little nervous because I don't like washing my quilts until it's cooled off in Texas. For those of you who don't know this, our water system is buried about 6 foot deep. The further you travel north, the farther the water is buried underground, so it does not freeze. And every summer, you know, it gets 100 plus down here. The water really warms up in the pipes to where you can take a shower and not even use your hot water heater. The water's that warm. So I was a little worried about bleed, because we all know fabrics bleed. Fabrics of today, don't be fooled. They're all synthetic dyes. They're all uber processed. You will have some that bleed, but predominantly they're not going to bleed onto one another to where it ruins a quilt. So I was really worried about fabric bleed, because there is a little bit of red in this. Let me find it. And because I think this quilt had already been wet with urine and wet dog, I think that actually pre-treated the fabric, so to speak, because it had already gotten wet and it did not bleed. Let's see. The red is not a lot. There's some red. There's the red that I was worried about. Okay, I was worried about that red running, especially that dark red right there. It did not bleed. And then after I got this done, I went ahead and took it, I washed it on that delicate cycle, put it on my little wooden clothes rack. You could also put it on the clothesline. And I dried it. And I dried it for about 6 hours. Right now in Texas, it's very dry. And it's about 26% humidity. And it dried pretty fast just with a fan blowing on it. And it was just a little bit damp. So I went ahead and threw it in the dryer for about 10 minutes. And when I took it out, I was absolutely amazed. So let's talk about this behind me. That's made with the interfacing grid. I'm still working on it. And my first two that I made, I starched the dickens out of the fabric, and then I'd iron it to the interfacing, and then I'd sew all my squares with the interfacing. And then I'd get it to the long arm. You do battle the interfacing of this when you're long arming. And so I even ironed it at the long arm to try and get it flat to where my seams wouldn't flip. And then you quilt it, and the quilt just does not puff. And I realized with this quilt, because we starch things and we want them perfect, and it helps us piece, and it helps take the fullness out of a block, I realized using starch, that quilt, it will not be as soft as others. Have you ever wondered why quilts from the past are softer than quilts of today? It's because back then they probably didn't heat up their sat iron on the wooden cook stove for the fire that they had to build, and they didn't take the time, because they had even less time than we did, because they had to wash clothes by hand. They had to do all these chores that today we've got our dishwasher to do, we've got our washing machine to do. So they had even less time, and I just don't believe that they stood over an ironing board and ironed. And so they just, obviously this was made with little bits and bobs. And then, so this quilt really, really puffed. It puffed to where it feels like an old quilt. But I didn't put any extra batting in the layers, nothing. It is so puffy and soft, completely soft. It is not stiff like a quilt would be that I would make today. So I learned that. That's why those quilts are softer. And they used different batting back then. But I'm telling you, for using a modern day batting, this quilt is soft. It quilted up exactly like any new fabric. I didn't have any problems with the fabric whatsoever. Now let's discuss the pattern. So on this, there's several of these yellow fabrics that are all the same, okay? And if you look, again, there's a seam in the middle. They purposely cut the fabric to make a different effect with this fabric. So here they've done this. Here they've cut it like this. Here they patched it. Okay, let me find a good one. Okay, all these come together and they're purposely running a different direction. So I wondered why everything was either not on the bias like it was supposed to be. And I realized the quilter took the same fabric and reinvented it and tried to turn it in a different direction to get a different effect, because she obviously didn't have enough fabric to finish this. That is probably why she did that with the muslin as well. At first I was very peeved that I was not going to be able to quilt this out, but in reality, it does not matter. All of the puckers after I washed it, I know they're there, but you can't tell. You cannot tell. Let me find a bad one. This one was the worst one. Can you tell it has puckers? I can't see any. They're there. This one was another bad one. You can see a little bit of puckers because of the light. But now that I've turned that block and the light's different, you can't tell it even has puckers. Puckers don't matter. We just are perfectionists. So this is extra soft. I learned about why they cut the fabric the way they did. This quilt really tells a story. I wish I would have got to meet the original quilt maker. I really wanted to give this the respect that it deserved with a finish, even though I had to go out of the norm to get it done. So there are many takeaways from this, and next time, ladies, you see some of your work that's imperfect, know that there are several quilters before you, several quilters currently, and several quilters after you that will make quilts imperfect. We are made imperfect, and we make things imperfect with our hands. Do not let that stop you in a project. Take it full throttle. Whatever the quilt decides to do. I've had a cat have babies on the quilt. She had 7. She got up on my table. She never gets up on the table. She had 7 babies on my quilt that I was quilting at my domestic machine. And then I was like, I can't finish this. I sat there with peroxide and I slowly got that stain out without having to put it in the wash machine. Would it have been fine if I would have put it in the wash machine? No, because I didn't have it completely quilted, so that would have had issues. But after learning this, I now have the knowledge, and I wanted to pass it on to you, that you can wash a quilt. Now here's the thing. I trimmed this quilt up before I bound it. And basically I got out my big 16-inch ruler square to go around the corners, and I cornered each one, and then took my other one and kind of went down, down, down with my rotary cutter a little bit at a time. And I trimmed off a little, and I realized because this was hand stitched, I was gonna have to boogie to get the binding on, because those knots were at the end. That was the only bad thing. I trimmed through some of those hand stitching, and am I worried about it coming apart? Not really, because I'm hoping the density of the stitch I used, I think will have caught it perfectly, and it caught it twice because I machine stitched it onto the quilt, and then I machine stitched it to finish it. So that was another thing that I did, and I will let you know about that one, but I'm pretty sure that this quilt will be okay. And I think it's because I had already washed and dried the quilt. All those fibers shrunk around that thread. It wasn't going anywhere unless I tugged on it. And believe it or not, because many of these were sewn incorrectly with the bias to the grain of fabric, I had very, very little fraying. You know, you can stick material, fabric in from today into the wash machine to pre-wash it before you mess with it, and you have a unraveled nightmare on the edge. This quilt did not unravel. It did not fray. I don't know why. I wonder now if they pre-washed the fabric or something. I don't know. I don't think they pre-washed the fabric because there was a lot of shrinkage. I need to measure this and see how much shrinkage I did have. Hang on. So this quilt was long enough that when I sewed my 2 pieces of 42 by 42, that made the backing 84 inches long. Yeah, is that right? Yes, minus the selvages. So approximately, let's say 83. And when I loaded it, I realized, oh, I'm really gonna cut it close on the long arm. And I did have problems quilting the last row because it was right there at my red snappers. Measuring this, it only measures 80 inches long, and I had about an inch at the top, so this only shrunk about an inch and a half long ways. I didn't measure the sides. I never measured this, so I assume that is because it was cut on the bias. There wasn't a lot of shrinkage. I don't know. I wonder how much old fabric was processed versus new fabric. And I wonder how much shrinkage I will have on a new quilt. I've never measured that, but I think I'm going to pay attention to that now because I don't think this one shrunk as much. Now, I only put it in the dryer for about 10 minutes, so it may still have shrinking left to do. Yeah. But as it shrinks, it's going to even draw up more and get even more softer. I am tickled pink for whoever made this top. I assume they are no longer on this earth, and I assume I've made them very happy because I finished their project. So yes, I'm crazy. I finished someone else's UFOs. And this was a big, long UFO. This is probably the longest one I've ever done. So there is still some stains on this where I didn't treat it with any stain cleaner because I was more worried about the smell. The thing with using chlorinated water, you can wash this quilt repeatedly and those stains will totally fade. It will come out over time. It being in the sunlight will fade it. I could hang it out in the moonlight. We had just had a super moon. The moonlight would fade the stains as well and brighten the muslin. So that's how they used to do things back in the olden days. I'm tickled. I wanted to share all of these secrets with you and make sure that I got this quilt revealed as it should be revealed. You need to check out that short. I put that on a separate video. It deserves it. Thank you for watching and stay tuned. I'm not sure what I'm going to do next. I have such a long list. I'll weed down my list and you'll see soon what I'm working on. Thanks for watching.